Welcome to AUA Leadership in Business, an official podcast of the American Urological Association. Today we have a special release featuring one of the courses included in the AUA Practice Management and Coding Program on demand. We hope you enjoy Auditing and the Risk of Not Doing It with guest Jaci Kipreos.
I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our time today. Anyone that knows me knows that audit is my heart and soul. Love to talk about it. So I really appreciate the chance to talk here. I have to tell myself not to get too excited because I truly get excited talking about audit. And I thought the topic here was interesting to have that opportunity to talk about maybe all the reasons some people think they shouldn't audit, and talk about maybe finding ways to disprove some of those reasons and find ways that we should be auditing. I think it's always important to start with a good definition of what audit is. I know we all, probably everybody knows what it is, but let's just kind of take it down to the nuts and bolts. It is truly a review, a thorough review of a patient's medical records to ensure accuracy and completeness. I mean, that's what it is when you're auditing for coding and documentation. And that's one statement holds true whether it's if you're auditing to look at a surgical procedure, the use of a modifier, the use of diagnosis codes. It doesn't have to be evaluation and management. And sometimes when we hear the word audit, that's what we start thinking, oh, our E&M. Audit is anything it needs to be. But that is one simple but true definition of an audit. Why do we audit? What's the objective? Identify discrepancies, look for opportunities, find errors, look for documentation deficiencies, anything that could impact patient care, because patient care is the whole environment. So if incorrect information is going out on a claim form, that will affect a patient. If you give a patient a diagnosis that represents something that they don't have, it's really hard to get that off your claim, so to speak, and it's really hard for that patient to get it off their profile with that payer. So we never want to give patients something they don't have. We don't want to say that a procedure was performed for any particular reason if it wasn't performed, and if maybe it never happened, it shouldn't have happened, it doesn't have anything to do with that particular patient. So it becomes very important to understand that it can impact patient care. It's not just impacting your bottom line. It's very important from all aspects. So when I was putting this together, I started thinking about it, and I have heard a lot of reasons why people, whether it's management, it can be a very small practice, it can be a hospital association, it's never mattered the size of the facility. I've heard a lot of reasons why there's a decision not to audit, whether it's right now or never, whatever it may be. I want to kind of bring those to the attention of everyone, and maybe you've heard them, maybe you've said them, and let's talk about, well, maybe that's a reason, but what's the consequence behind it? Are you ready to deal with that as well? One of the first reasons I hear a lot of is we don't have a budget for it. Can't pay for an audit. We really can't afford one right now. Okay, that's fair. However, do you have budget set aside because you didn't audit to pay for anything that's building up? Maybe there's a slight problem. It could be something so small. Maybe you missed an update through Medicare. Maybe it was an update through your one of your payers, commercial payers, and maybe you missed it. And now, you can't say I didn't know because it was published, but you missed it. And now you're doing something incorrectly, calculating your time. I know that I did not catch immediately when CMS changed their guidelines for how to count critical care. And it came to my attention probably 6 months after they had done it. And I was like, wow, that was a big miss on my part. And I had to go back and look and see when did they actually put that information in there. And it didn't become public knowledge like in my typical ways I go find things for about 6 months after it was actually effective. So in the meantime, fortunately, I didn't have any critical care auditing at the time, but if I had, I might have missed it. Or if I was working in a practice, might have missed it. So yes, you may not have a budget. One thing I want to make clear as we go through this, though, when you hear the word audit, it doesn't mean big and it doesn't mean just E&M. It can be something so small. You can review one thing, 10 claims, one thing, you can keep it internal. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but you do need to think about what's important if there is any suspicion that something may be maybe not perfect. All you're doing is building on the expense that's going to go out the door later. Some say that, well, my EMR code's for me. I spent all this money on this brand new EMR. It is the Cadillac of systems and it can do it all. Well, that's good. And that's great. And it probably can pick some stuff out of a note. It probably can add the correct specificity to a diagnosis code or cue the provider that more things are needed. But what can it do for things that people have been talking about all day in some of your presentations, like split shared? Can it pick up on that? So we've had people talking about split shared, incident 2. Can it pick up on that? And if you're reporting it, can your EMR do that for you? Can it assign modifiers correctly? Does it know what to look for in the documentation? Is it going to cue you to do it, or do you just need to remember to do it? What about path guidelines? If you have students, residents, teaching physicians, will your EMR, yes, it'll give you the attestations. Yes, it'll build that macro, but will it know how to use it and check to make sure that everything's being done correctly? What about documentation compliance for signatures, dates of service? It's going to say you didn't sign this in time, your signature has not been performed correctly. What about procedures? Does it check that everything that goes into even the smallest procedure note, like prepping the patient, giving them risk, saying that the patient was okay after the procedure, any of those things, does it know to look for that? You, again, and I'm going to say it, and anybody that knows me knows I'm famous for repeating myself, so I'm going to start right now. When you hear audit, don't think it has to be huge, and it doesn't have to be everything. You can break this down and I think this time we'll just look at a few procedures. Pick what it is you want to look at and look at it. Think about that EMR in which you've set it up to do, and I'm sure it can do many wonderful things. But somebody programmed that to do those wonderful things. So at some point, it needs to be audited as well. This is the one I hear, and I feel really bad for the people that are saying it to me. There you go. We're getting paid. We don't need to look at that. We're getting paid. Okay. So when you got paid, there was a CPT code and an ICD-10 code, and they probably matched. And if it was a procedure, you probably got authorization. So it probably got paid. But does that mean that the documentation is there supporting everything that was done? Getting paid means the claims matched, it was clean, and it went through, the payer received it, clean claim, paid it. That never will tell you that your documentation is correct. It will never tell you if the documentation will uphold any modifier. It will never tell you that everything was done compliantly and correctly. So getting paid is great, but the further you go, getting paid means there's more money that potentially could go back if you're not looking. Yes, all the providers went to the same workshop, heard the same speakers, so they are to the good. They know what to do. Great. When they came back, did they sit down and powwow with the billing and coding, or anybody in the revenue cycle or management and say, these are the things we were told, let's make sure we're all on the same page? Did that conversation happen? Are you sure that everything they learned is appropriate, compliant, and actually fits your? Make sure of that, because it's great when somebody goes to a workshop and they bring back solid, good information and you can move forward with it. I'm all about it. Just make sure you've made sure it's good information. Another reason is, well, if we audit and we find something, then we got to do something with the results. Yeah, you do. Especially if it's a federal payer, you need to know in advance that you may have to do something. So in those situations, and we'll talk about this later, you might want to do a proactive audit. Look at something before the claim goes out the door to see if there's a problem going out the door, because a lot of audits are retrospective, so it's already been paid. But if you really are concerned, do it proactive. Look before it goes out the door. See if you can stop some problems before they happen. Otherwise, yes, you need to have a plan ready of how you're going to handle the results and how you're going to decide what to do with them. Will it be commercial payers that you need to contact to say, we found this mistake, this is what we're going to do about it? Will it be Medicare or Medicaid that has a plan for you when that happens? So that sort of thing, you're going to make some decisions about it. But yes, you will need to make sure you know what to do with the results. So now I'll say this, and I'll probably repeat this many times. That's why it's so important to have compliance policies and audit policies. Audit policies become a part of your compliance policy. And having a good audit policy will know what to do when you have results. Don't have any Medicare patients. Why would we ever need to audit? Pediatrics. Why would we ever audit? We don't have any Medicare patients. Well, do you have Medicaid? Because that can be a problem. Do you have Medicare Advantage programs? Have you reviewed recently all the rules of your commercial payers dealing with modifiers, incident to, split shared, and are you following those rules appropriately? So just because you don't have Medicare is not a reason to say we don't need to audit. You need to do a little bit of homework first, but don't fool yourself. All payers have that ability to request records. And you definitely want to understand what their plan is and understand what their rules are and what will they be auditing for? What are they looking for? So great that you don't have any Medicare patients, but that doesn't mean no one's going to audit you. This is a good one. We've hired certified coders. Yes, and we want to put our trust in someone who's gone through all the effort to become certified. And especially if it's a CPMA, someone who's taken the time to learn how to audit. They've got all kinds of credentials. There's many organizations that provide credentials. I only mention like CPA because I'm more associated with AAPC, but there's lots of organizations, lots of ways for people to become certified. But we're human. We all have to look behind ourselves. When I do an audit, I have people look behind me. We have to, because we're human. So yes, you have certified coders or certified auditors or certified billers or people who are educated to do that job. You still want to make sure that things are being performed consistently and in a compliant manner. We know that we know that a lot of our billing rules can be, I guess, to put it politely, convoluted at times. Maybe everyone on the team doesn't agree on how a rule should go. So you want to make sure that things are going out consistently the same way and the same rules are being applied. I would say, I can't think of an organization right now that does not, and I'm talking like consulting firms that have auditors and coders. They all get audited as well. And within your own practice, if there's auditors or coders that are applying the codes and looking over provider work, you still want an audit because it's a team effort. Coders and auditors and providers all working together. So yes, it's happy that you have certified people. You still have to have an audit. Now, there could be plenty more reasons. Those are the ones I hear most often. And that might still be your reason. Hopefully you can just open up a little bit and think about it. I'd rather spend more time talking about the audit itself and why you do want to audit. So let's listen to some reasons of why you should. And these reasons are coming from people that you should trust. So this is not me, these are others. So from the MGMA, why do they say you should audit? It's to review quality of coding to ensure accuracy is met. Absolutely. So the MGMA, very strong behind auditing. Areas of strength and weakness can be identified. Absolutely. You can actually look at data and compare from year to year. You can give those kudos to those providers who are doing great, and maybe then they'll help you in that education with others. You want to build a really good team. It also finds opportunities. So it's not always bad news with an audit. Sometimes it's great opportunities that are found. AAPC, they have a statement on auditing. Medical auditing is systematic performance assessment within a healthcare organization. Of course it is, because you can audit anything. Anything when that revenue cycle can be audited. You can look at how your payments are coming in and what's happening to them. You can look at how things are going out the door. You can look at documentation. You can look at just diagnosis codes, just modifiers. You can look at any part of that revenue cycle, and it can be an audit. You can audit your policies that you've written internally and audit to be sure that policies are being followed correctly as well. It is a vital role in the organization's compliance plan. You definitely want to have a compliance plan, and a part of that would be your audit plan. The AMA makes a statement on why you audit. Audits can help to protect against fraudulent claims and billing activity, of course, and nobody wants to have that happen. Identifying correct problem areas before insurance or government payers challenge inappropriate coding. Of course, you want to find it first. You always want to be the first one to find an issue. You don't want someone to find it and call it out to your attention. And it's, we say that a lot when we audit. We're like, you'd rather have me find it than somebody else, because then if it's something very severe or potentially, you can get it under attorney-client privilege before it goes too far. And that can help you out. So it's always nice to get that clean bill of health. Everything's great. Or we found something, we can fix it now and make things better. And from the AMA, they definitely are going to add, stop the use of outdated or incorrect codes for procedures or diagnosis. And that can happen. You find that certain parts of your system were not updated. Yes, it's going to cause a denial. Yes, it can be fixed. Yes, you can resend the claim, but you just tied up a lot of time. And that value on that payment is depreciating as it's happening. So you want to make sure that things are going out timely and they're going out correctly. You don't want to get a claim that should have been caught, prior to going out the door, come back, make an easy fix, and then send it out. So audit helps with all those things as well, which is really very, very helpful. The OIG, I think we all know what their thoughts on audit are. It's a part of the 7 steps of compliance. Even when they changed their compliance plans, coming into 2024, the OIG updated a lot of their statements and a lot of their work, their plans with compliance, but it's still audit. It's still a part of the plan. And if you show in good faith that you have a compliance plan that includes regular audit, it looks good. You're doing your best. You're doing what, yes, things can happen. Things can slide by and it gets missed. Audit shows that you're doing your best to catch everything that you can. If you're in a very large facility with lots of different specialties and many, many different physicians, sometimes it's difficult to get everyone audited once a year. So sometimes you end up concentrating on certain areas each year, and something may get missed until that audit does occur. And you might have other ways of monitoring, but you certainly want to make it a part of compliance, and you certainly want to look for things as quickly as possible and keep it on your radar. Here are some of my personal reasons why I think auditing is important. So this is what I believe to be important things, why we should audit. Risk avoidance, and that's kind of what I've been talking about a lot. So again, audit can be any part of the process. You want to look for anything. Audit can identify risk in any part of the revenue cycle. From here's the claim going out the door, does my scrubber work? Or are claims that are supposed to be reviewed by a person, are they actually getting reviewed by a person? You can even start with the documentation. Are signatures happening in a timely manner? Do you have a policy on cloning? Is someone looking at that to make sure that providers are following internal policies and cloning, signatures, anything that you have a policy for? There's a risk associated with these items. So you want to make sure that you've got that risk avoidance built into a good audit policy. You have to remember that when we say audit, it's not coding. It's not just coding. It's not just evaluation and management, and it's not just coding. You can do an audit of payments coming back in. When payments are coming in and an EOB hits, are all the denials being worked appropriately, or are items being written off for no reason? Do you have a policy on to handle any letters that come from payers? You could audit that policy. Are those letters being responded to in a timely manner? If anyone gets a letter from a RAC agency, whatever your region is, your RAC, is there a policy on how to handle those so they don't get buried in someone's stacks of letters? And are they being handled correctly? I worked with a group once, and that was one of the first things we recognized. Those RAC letters were coming in. They were going to someone in accounts payable, and they were writing a check without anybody reviewing the reason for the letter and the request for payment. That's something that could go on for a really long time in a large facility, a large system. If you're not following, it could happen in a small system if there's not a rule on what to do and follow up. That's audit. Audit is following behind rules and making sure that rules have been applied, whether it's a coding rule, a billing rule, whatever it may be. And if it's a policy, are you following it? Audit can also be how money is taken from, if patients are paying in cash, how is that calculated and who takes that to the bank? Is the same person who's stacking the money together the same person that makes the deposit? Is there checks and balances within your system? And I know that sounds crazy because you would think I'm talking just about coding audits, but I want you to just understand audit can be anything. And anything and everything should be audited. So I think I'm driving that point home, whether you agree with me or not. Billing audits, claims audits are just one of those many examples I've talked about of stepping out of your box for what you believe audit means. Comparative data. You'll never know if you're getting better if you're not looking. That's one way to know if things are improving. So bell curves. I personally am not a big proponent of bell curves when I compare a group of physicians to another group of physicians. Internally, comparing physicians towards each other, that's a little bit different because you're looking at their data compared to their peers within their group. When I start thinking about bell curves outside of one group, and even if it's the group down the street and their peers, same specialty, now I have to start trusting that they know what they're doing. How do I know if they know what they're doing? Maybe they're billing level 4s and 5s and they don't have a clue of how to do that, and their documentation isn't correct and they shouldn't be doing it. But internally, if you've had the education, you've had audit, there should be some comfort that your bell curve should be reflective of the work that you're doing. And if you compare to each other internally, then you might be able to see if there's an outliner internally and just look at that one provider or a few. It's much easier to understand a bell curve internally because hopefully everyone got the same education, everyone's been hearing the same thing, everybody's using the same system, and it makes it a little bit easier to compare that data versus your providers against the rest of the country. You know, who knows what type of education anybody else got. So that's my opinion of bell curves. A lot of people disagree with me, and I'm absolutely comfortable with that. But that's just, it's hard to understand how we can believe that everybody's billing correctly, and that's what, you know, your Medicare data bell curves are based on. So have a look at internally and see how your providers look. See how their bell curves look the next year after some audit and education. Are things the same because everything was good and it's staying good? Or was there opportunity found? And maybe their bell curve that was shifting a bit to the left is now more of a bell curve, a little more to the right. You know, look at that. Comparative data is very important because it can help you from a budget perspective as well, kind of foresee what's coming up in the next year. You can use this not just for E&M, but for your procedures, surgeries, anything that's billable that is of importance. You can look at that data and decide, are we improving? Are we doing more of? Are we doing it correctly? Are your frequency changing each year? Is it, and why? Is there a reason that there's more of a particular type of procedure? Is there a reason there's more of a certain level of service? Are there more hospital visits than before? When you use this data, because you have to look at it, and you might as well be auditing it, is there something that's showing up in audit that's revealing even more answers to some of these questions? All this comparative data will certainly help you for your expectations into the next year. I think it is very important with comparative data to look at a lot of things and help you decide where you do want to audit. You might be looking at all of this, but not using it for audit. You might be using it for other reasons. When you look at this data, think about, wow, we have some outliers in some different areas. We might want to look at that. And again, I'd say audit, but that doesn't mean 100 notes. You can look at, if you see that there's a change in procedures, look at 5 notes. If it's a change in one provider's activities, look at a few notes. That's all, and that's still an audit. So again, I'm repeating because I want to drive that home. And I don't want anyone to think that, oh my gosh, she's talking about so much audit and we'll never get, you know, how did we get our regular work done if we're doing all this? Doesn't have to be huge. It can be something small as well. You can plan for your expectations, check your frequencies, bell curves, all of that, just fine. You can do all those things. I love this phrase, and I guess I can show my age because I remember Andy Griffith really well, and I remember Barney always nip it in the bud, and I love that phrase, and it holds true. Nip it in the bud. Find it. New provider, look at their notes within that first month. New procedures, new services, new staff, new policy. Check it out. If you have a new staff that's a coder, check it out. Monitor, audit, look behind them, nip it in the bud. You might get a new provider. Don't wait for them to get into the audit whatever, like if you're on an audit time frame, it might be a year before you look at their notes. Well, if there was something not going well, you got a year's worth of not going well in there. I would have a look within, no, I wouldn't wait any longer than 3 months. That's my opinion. And you have to decide, what are they doing? You can do a bell curve first if it's mainly E&M. If it's procedures, look how they're doing them. You can check those procedure notes pretty easily. If it's new staff, a new coder, new biller, you know, you might have peer review of people who do that same job. That's still an audit, but you definitely want to make sure that they are staying up to date and doing things appropriately. New policies in the office that everyone has signed off on, definitely check that out within 3 months for sure, no longer than. especially if it's a policy that has to do with any type of documentation, billing, anything like that, but new policies in particular. I'm going to pause here and take this question. Happy's asking, we use an outside billing company. How often do you suggest an audit be performed? If you're out of your outside billing company, I think you would want to, at least on an annual basis. Again, it could be you're not getting any denials. Okay, that's great. Internally, you want to be checking your own documentation, so definitely. And then you want an audit of if they're billing, and especially if they're getting the payments back in and applying those, I would definitely look at that at a minimum once a year. If it's never been done before, I'd pick a date and say, okay, we're going to do it. And then every year we'll do it. Unless something comes up that makes you wonder what's going on, then do a small audit. Internally, making sure your documentation's correct at a minimum annually. And it doesn't have to be big. I hope I answered your question. If I didn't, just add a little more content to it and I'll make sure I address it more fully. I had mentioned this before, and I'll say it again. It reflects the intent to do the right thing. And that's what we all want to do. We just want to do the right thing. You want to show that an error was found, education was provided, corrections were made, and that goes a long way with your intent to be compliant. It certainly does. It speaks volumes. I know that when I have worked before under privilege with an attorney, and mainly because the client felt there was going to be a problem from the beginning, we were very careful to lay out that education, what it should look like once something was found. And we all as a team made sure that that education took place very quickly so that when information went to the payer concerning the finding, we were able to say, this is what we did, these were the corrections, and let them know that we're going to re-review to verify that corrections have been made. Some corrections, depending on the scenario, can be shown immediately. I know, especially with incident 2, for some reason that is still a problem. I know it's been spoken about today, and I don't know why. The rule's been around forever and it's still confusing. And it's not a confusing rule. It's so difficult to operationalize. It is a very difficult rule to put into operation within the practice, within the office. And when you see that error, you can stop that day. You're just not going to do it right now until we can figure out a better way. So sometimes when I'm doing an audit and I see consistently it's incorrect, sometimes it's a phone call, nothing in writing, a phone call. We need to stop. We need to talk about this now and kind of put a halt on this. It may need to go under privilege, and we need to stop the activity until we can find the right way to get it done. So if you're doing this and you have that education, it shows you have the intent to make it right. You're not trying to get away with something. You're not trying to say something else. And that's helpful. So all of these things, again, is all leading up to, it's not difficult to do. It's really just having your eye on things. But by having it in a policy and sticking to the policy, and yes, it takes time, energy, and effort. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But if you have a team or if you have external individuals who can do this for you, there's no negative in getting it done. And this is the one we were just talking about. Find it before someone else does. That's the worst. If you see a little bit of a problem, it's like, what is it, in airports? And I was on a train 2 days ago, airports and train stations. If you see something, say something. It's kind of, you might want to have those signs up in the office as well. If you see something, say something. If it doesn't feel right, chances are it's not. And it could be something so simple, something so incredibly simple that you're like, oh, would have never known that was a problem. And it could be just in the way something's written. A provider forgetting, so just Mark was talking about split shared, and it could be performed perfectly. Everybody's doing their job. But when it came to the documentation, the provider forgot to say something about actually discussing with the NPP, but they're agreeing to something that they never talked about. You know, it's just leaving out little things. So look for it. Look for anything that would raise an eyebrow, definitely make someone to want to look more, anything that looks like there could be a risk. So thinking about all the discussions you've heard today and thinking about all that important information, what are the things that have to be documented? What are the key words you want? If you're thinking about, are your providers documenting time correctly? When it's either a time-based code or an evaluation and management based on time. Are they saying the words correctly? Are they saying things that don't make sense? Look at your macros. That's what I've been telling providers a lot recently. Look at all your macros. Are they really saying what you want them to say? And you know you can't rely on those and just that. Are you filling in the missing pieces? Are you remembering to write the rest of the stuff? I mean, little things. I mean, seriously, I worked with the practice, and I slightly mentioned this before. They did small procedures in the office, and nowhere did they, in any of their macros or in their own documentation, did they mention that the patient was prepped. They never said they cleaned the area, wasn't prepped, nothing. And they never said the patient was okay. And they never said the patient agreed. They did the procedure. We had that. So I could say, yes, you met the CPT code. Yes, you did the procedure. But from a compliance standpoint, you've got some risk issues here of not saying the patient agreed. And you're not telling me that you made the area clean, and you didn't tell me the patient was okay when they left. You know, there's a lot of risk involved. So don't think just coding, you know, think about all the things that go into documentation. What's appropriate documentation for a procedure? Minimum. What's the appropriate documentation for discussion of risk? What's the appropriate documentation when you say that during a larger procedure, an ultrasound was, there was ultrasound. Are they saying that it was, ultrasound was used and that picture is permanently held? Does the code say that it has to be a permanent image? Are we saying that it is? I mean, think about all of those things. Yes, it can start to build up after a while, but if you think about what the code description is, are you leaving any room for risk in the documentation? That's what you're really looking for. And because of electronic medical records and macros, you don't have to look at a lot of notes because most of them will start to follow the same pattern after a while. And when they do that, you don't have to look at many of them, because if it's that same era, it's going to be repeated over and over and over, like a copy and paste. I remember once doing an audit for a vascular surgeon, and that vascular surgeon used, if I remember right, 3 separate macros, 3 separate ones for every surgery. And for some reason, this was a random selection of 10 of his one particular type of surgery, 10 randomly selected, and in that random selection, for some reason, every patient had the same macro saying that their anatomy was unusual, altered, always the same part of the anatomy, and therefore required the 22 modifier, and every one of them was exactly the same. I was like, isn't that odd that out of 10 random selection, every one had the same altered anatomy? Just amazing. And what he was doing was taking bits and pieces of different macros, thus making a note that made no sense, because he would start in one part of the anatomy and then suddenly a note would go somewhere else, you know, because you're following that vascular. I'm like, if it's vascular, you're somewhere. You can't just hop, skip, and jump somewhere else without telling me how you got there. So you want to look for things like that. And that's why you want to find it before someone else, because when I find that, It's going to be education. I'm not saying you didn't do the service. I'm saying we need to be careful with our macros. A payer might look at that and lose all thoughts of integrity associated with that note, and they may question a lot more than that. That's why you want to find it before someone else. I would say the majority of external auditors, internal, it's easy to know we're all rooting for the same thing. External auditors, we're rooting for the provider. We want things to look good, but our job is to look for everything and scrutinize it. But when we find it, it's let's talk about this and make it better. I'm not saying what you're going to do with those results. That's something you're going to come up with, but I want to help make it better immediately. Like today, let's make that right today. And so let's go forward correctly. So that's why you want to find it before anybody else does. I know I feel like I'm on my soapbox here, but I'll tell you, audit just, there's so many potential things. And I feel like some people hear the word and get stuck into E&M, big effort, big, huge thing. There are so many opportunities that can be found in audit as well. Hopefully, whoever is auditing out there and whoever audits for you, they also identify items that were not reported but were documented. There's so many opportunities. Sometimes it's prolonged care with E&M. Sometimes it's procedures that were done in the office but were not reported, but they were actually documented and supported a 25 modifier. Lots of things, nebulizer treatments with ENT. And I'm sure you can think of many things within your specialty, because sometimes they're just small procedures. The post-void, we did an audit not too long ago for, it was a urologist, and definitely was performed the post-void urine in one bill. But we found it, and there was no payer issue that it wasn't billed. And the documentation was wonderful. So you just want to find it, because even undercoding, like the documentation is great. And with these new guidelines, getting a level 4 is not really difficult sometimes, or you can use time, whichever it may be. But when I see providers with these guidelines reporting level 2s and 3s, and I see 3 diagnosis codes that were all supported, I start scratching my head. I'm like, well, okay, how'd that happen? And it can, trust me, I know it can, because it could be all over-the-counter medication. It could be there was very little of anything ordered or reviewed. I get it. But it does make me wonder, is there an opportunity here? You definitely want to find opportunity. That is one of the wonderful things about auditing, is you can find that. You're not looking, audit's going to find everything. Don't think that just because you're getting an audit, you have to prepare yourself for the results. Like, oh my gosh, the doctors are going to be so upset. The providers are going to be like, oh my goodness, we're going to be paying back. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're not paying back anything. Maybe what you're going to find out is you missed some opportunity. Recently, there was an audit. It was 100 randomly selected claims. There was a thought that the providers were upcoding. Come to find out, they were undercoding. I think out of 100, we found 2 that did not support the level, and we found at least, I'd say 25 to 30 that at a different level. So never think that it's going to be a payback end result. You may find that there's opportunity, and with opportunity comes that education. And that's why it's nice to compare those bell curves internally, because everybody's going to get the same message and the same education. This is a really good reason to audit, and I'm hoping most of you do have internal policies for anything that's noted on the screen, and you should have internal policies for all of these items, but just audit for those. You can audit, and if you're doing a regular audit, hopefully you're looking for all of this, at least the signature dates, the cloning issues, timely filing, you can look at. If there is a policy in the office on what types of drugs will not be prescribed, that might be a peer review that we'll talk about. You might want a clinician to read notes. But if you have an internal policy on anything, you can find someone that's the appropriate person to do that sort of review to make sure that your internal policies are being upheld. That's very important, to make sure that you've made all that effort to get a policy written and then it's not being followed and you didn't check to see. That's not very good. So you want to make sure that you are adhering to policies. If you are working with an external vendor for your audits, make sure they're aware of your policies so that they can include that in their audit and you can get all of that at one time. It becomes very helpful that way. Definitely by auditing, you're going to adhere to your CPT and I-10 guidelines as well, not just evaluation and management, any unbundling. We find so many misrepresentation of ICD-10 codes with their instructions, not using the combination codes, listing symptoms, primary versus the confirmed diagnosis, all of these things. And remember how important diagnosis codes are. I mean, they can cause a denial for various reasons. And a phrase that I like to use is, especially with evaluation and management, selecting a level of evaluation and management code is how hard the provider felt they worked that day. But their diagnosis codes, when coded correctly with the correct level of specificity, will show absolutely how hard they had to work that day. So think of diagnosis codes that way, and you definitely don't always audit the documentation for diagnosis codes. Always include diagnosis codes. They're just too important today. And if it's risk adjustment you're looking at, have that sort of audit. They can be done too. You can look at it from that perspective. These things I've mentioned a little bit before. If you've got a lot of commercial payers and not as much Medicare, and if you're not sure that you want to hold the office to a Medicare rule, then within your individual commercial payers, you need to go back through their websites, whatever they've sent you, and you've got to make sure that you're adhering to their policies. And I've only listed a few things here. As you know, there's so many more things you could be looking at. But how are they going to catch any of the, what are their rule? And if it's a time requirement or something, what's their retirement time requirement? Do they even accept incident 2 or split share? Will they even recognize it? What's their bottom line on that modifier 25, 59, 22 modifiers as well? So you really want to take that dive into that. And you could take any one of these things and do an audit on just that one thing to see if you are adhering to policies. And definitely, this happens, and you know it does. All you need is one person to be upset, leave the practice, and they take information with them. They don't need to take paperwork. They just need to call and make a statement. And then it happens. I just finished up 2 projects just off this, and they were huge. And it was a lot of time, energy, and effort just to prove the person wrong. But all they have to do is start it, create a problem, and then you're just basically chasing your tail trying to prove them wrong. It is great when you can follow a claim from beginning to end. It truly is. If you can do that sort of audit, a claims audit, in addition to a documentation audit, like one whole process, it is very consuming to do, but you can find a lot. Was the documentation correct? Did we put correct codes on the claim? Yes. Checkbox, yes. Now it went out the door and came back. What happened when it came back? Were we paid appropriately? Did we get a denial for a reason that we were unsure of? Why did we get a denial? We didn't know they had that sort of policy. What happened with that denial? Was it paid? Did we try again? Did we look at the document? What did you do? That will go all the way through the whole process, and you can learn a lot about that. You can learn that everybody's doing their job, which is a great thing to learn. You don't have to just suspect it. You'll have proof. Due diligence, absolutely. If you're buying, selling, bringing on a new provider, you have to do your due diligence, and that is going to be in an audit. No other way to do it. What you're going to have to do is if you're selling your practice, someone's going to audit. If you're buying a practice, you need to audit. If you're bringing on a new provider, you need to find a way to audit what are they bringing with them? Are they bringing good habits or bad habits? There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's your diligence, and that's part of a due diligence process. All right. I think you know who's auditing these days, but in case you didn't, there's all your acronyms to tell you who's doing it. If you're not familiar with any of these acronyms, you might want to look them up. And who's auditing? I bet your peers down the road are doing audits internally, making sure they're doing the right thing. Payers are auditing. We know everybody. Payers, the MACs, the RACs, the ZPIC, everybody's doing some sort of audit. So go ahead and jump on the bandwagon and join them and do some audits and be prepared. And look and see what they are auditing. What's on the work plan for the OIG? What are the RACs looking at? Because if they're looking, you want to be looking too. You might as well see what's important to everybody and see if it affects you or your practice. I'm not going to spend a lot of time as we wrap up on the types of audit. These are the things I'm sure you know, but I just wanted to remind you to help hone in on it doesn't have to be huge. There are all types of audits. You know, you can break it start into two things like this: totally random or focused. Totally random is we're just going to pick 10 claims from this provider from the prior year. You might limit it to just office, or you might limit it to just hospital. You can limit it, but we're going to just pick 10 randomly from the prior year, and we'll do that for every provider. You can do that, but it is random. You can use the OIG's rat stats from their website, make it totally random. Or you can say, we're just going to focus in on one thing. We have an outlier. We're just going to look at that one provider, and we're just going to look at that levels 3, 4, and 5. That's all. We're going to look at their office visits. We're going to look at their established patients, because that's where we see an issue. Or we are just starting to, maybe you're just starting to go to the hospital. Well, let's look at those. Let's look at that documentation, some of those claims right after we get started. Maybe it's one type of service, something new that you're doing in the practice. Want that new provider, whatever it may be. Or there's a policy with the payer that you weren't sure about. Audit the notes that pertain to that policy with that payer. Peer review is a great kind of audit. That's when it's provider to provider. And that type of audit can confirm medical necessity. They can look at any medical or clinical policies within the practice. And if that physician or provider works with a documentation coder auditor, then you've got an incredible audit going on. So that can work really well too. We have internal and we have external, of course. You know, internal is someone within the organization. They have familiarity with the system. External auditors, the key there is they're totally unbiased. They're going to look at this. They don't know everything. When you work internally, sometimes you have a little more forgiveness of things because you know how things work internally. If I'm external, I don't know how your practice runs, and I'm going to look at it as a payer does. Fresh set of eyes, no bias on it. Even if it's a client I've been working with for years, it's still going to be unbiased. I don't have that buy-in as working there. It's different, but we all know the definitions there. Prospective, I talked about before, that's in real time. Hopefully getting a clean claim in. We're retrospective, we're looking at it's been paid, but it gives you more time to do more. Because if it's prospective, you have some timely filing you want to look at. Just remember that you can audit anything. Most of these I've already talked about. I was trying to involve it all because I knew we'd be going to the end of time here. You can look at anything, but if you don't know where to start, think about some of these questions before you start. Look and see what others are doing. If you've never done it, do a baseline, just a general, 10 to 15 notes, everybody, see what you get. Look at the OIG work plan, RAC website, bell curves. Look at your, what's going out the door. Look at those diagnosis codes. Any unspecified codes, you don't want those. And anything, any part of the practice can be audited. Anything. Just keep that in mind. So in summary, just do it. Do it. There will always be a reason not to. I haven't found any of them be very convincing yet. The positives will always outweigh the negatives. If you're not sure what to do, start small, expand over time. Best way to let it go. And I thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today on the AUA Leadership and Business Podcast. We hope you found today's insights valuable. Enhance your expertise further with the AUA Practice Management and Coding Program on demand, designed to empower providers and coders with the tools to optimize practice efficiency and ensure quality patient care. Visit auau.auanet.org for more information and to register. Until next time, continue to learn, lead, and excel.